Our insatiable appetite for information has gone digital. Once upon a time, knowledge seekers ventured into libraries, thumbing through card catalogs and dusty volumes. Today, we simply speak our questions in the form of a prompt, and artificial minds spring to life with answers. But this convenience comes with a hidden cost, one measured in terawatts. In the sprawling data centers that power our AI revolution, rows upon rows of servers hum with activity, each query demanding its share of electricity. These digital brains, built on advanced processing chips from companies with trillion-dollar valuations on the stock market, consume power at rates that would make earlier computers blush. Tech giants like the Magnificent Seven aren't waiting for solutions either. They're creating them. Their bring-your-own-energy approach, investing in nuclear power after years of renewable energy projects, signals a recognition that our digital future requires more than just solar panels and wind turbines. The mathematics of our energy future is both simple and staggering. Current data center power supplies, even those meeting the stringent 80-plus titanium standard with 90% efficiency, still waste enough energy to power small cities. Each percentage point of efficiency gained or lost has massive implications for our planet and our pockets. Enter silicon carbide, a material that promises to revolutionize how we handle power. Like a master conductor leading an orchestra, silicon carbide manages electricity with unprecedented precision and efficiency. Whether it's guiding power from a nuclear power plant through an omnidirectional grid or converting it for use in a data center server rack, this remarkable semiconductor reduces waste at every step. Think of the power grid as a vast river system. Traditional materials are like leaky canals, losing precious energy along the way. Silicon carbide creates superhighways for electricity, ensuring more power reaches its destination. In the world of data centers, where every watt counts, this efficiency isn't just an improvement, it's a necessity. As we stand at this crossroads of digital transformation and energy demand, the path forward becomes clear. The answer isn't just about generating more power. It's about using it more intelligently. Silicon carbide technology offers us a way to quench our growing thirst for energy without draining our resources dry. The future we're building, with its artificial intelligence at the helm, demands power on an unprecedented scale. But with innovations like silicon carbide leading the charge, we're not just facing this challenge, we're transforming it into an opportunity for a more efficient, sustainable world. How can Microchip technology help prepare us for the future energy demands data centers and AI will require? Let's go beyond the microchip and hear a story of empowering innovation to enhance the human experience. Our guest today is Nitesh Satish. Nitesh is a product marketing manager at Microchip Technology working under the Silicon Carbide business unit. He joins us today from our headquarters in Chandler, Arizona. Welcome, Nitesh.
Thank you, Dana, for having me here.
Thanks for joining us here on Beyond the Microchip. In the intro, we briefly talked about growing energy needs in data centers that we're not ready for, mostly due to AI. Tell us about it.
So one specific term I caught on was terawatts. Terawatts, how many zeros in a tera? It's hard to fathom, right? So imagine doubling the amount of energy needed just to power AI data centers from today to 2 years from now, and maybe doubling, tripling that until the end of the decade. It's mind-boggling. So where does all this energy go? It could go to powering the actual data center in the rack. It could go as wasted energy in your HVAC system. It could go as wasted energy in the conversion that happens from the grid to the actual data center. It could be any one of these, right? So we at Microchip want to focus on all of these different aspects to help bring a better tomorrow in terms of how we use this energy.
So you saw a grid that we talked about offline. It was an exponential curve growth where what you compared it to was a single ChatGPT prompt, for example, versus a single Google search. And it takes 10x the energy. What's going on there?
Absolutely right. And that's today. So tomorrow, it could be 20x or it could be 5x. And that's all dependent on the large language models that the Mag 7 that you earlier mentioned are working on. So with Google, they've refined their databases. They've refined the information going into these systems. Whereas with AI, everything is unknown. So as the data sets increase, the amount of power needed to compute these data sets increase too. So it's very hard to keep track of, what that consumption could be on any given query. So the 10x is for a word prompt. What if you wanted to do something more than a word prompt? So there's been talk of software engineer-less coding agents. What amount of energy would that take? So it's hard to tell where that market's going. The only thing we could do is be prepared for the increasing demand and the increasing requirements for these efficiencies.
Right. So that gets us to the idea of bring your own energy. So our existing power grid has a couple of different flavors, right? We've got coal, we've got solar, we've got wind, geothermal, not sure which, hydroelectric, I guess you would call it. And then that gets back to nuclear, which is probably the worst managed brand in the history of energy, right?
Yeah. So the one thing people, I think, have forgotten over the last couple of decades is you need a base load supply. So there's energy requirements that you need all the time, and there's all of these energy requirements that come in over peaks and troughs. So solar, for instance, is great during the day. Wind, for instance, is great when the conditions are perfect. But if there's too much wind, you have a problem. If there's too little wind, you have a problem. So what this does to the grid is it creates an imbalance of distributed energy generation and distributed energy usage. So the base load provided by large energy projects, it could be thermal, it could be nuclear, it could be hydroelectric, but any constant energy generation mechanism allows for a stability on the grid. So what that means is less outages during, peaks that, otherwise could have been spurred by everybody getting home at the same time and turning on their air conditioning or, data centers in this instance. But I think the realization is that we need the increase in base load, but at a sustainable, there needs to be a sustainable way to do it. And nuclear has come out to be an option.
So we're talking about base load. I'm reminded of an image that I saw before, which is like a duck. Was that something that you're familiar with? The idea was, of all the different types of energy, and if you thought about this kind of weird line graph that drew itself a duck, and I'm thinking now about how my 8-year-old draws things, but what you're basically looking at is the tail is the morning, and then you have all of the different flavors of energy, and it all ends at sundown.
Yeah.
Because that's usually when the wind and the sun stop. And then that's the duck bill is what's left is basically what you're talking about of base load, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the utilities have tried to solve that in, different ways. They've had what they call utility scale batteries. It could be, flow batteries of some sort, or it could be flying capacitors, but they're all stopgap, right? At some point, you need to fulfill that with something that's everlasting, and that's not going to be a battery.
So there was another graphic that we talked about, which was the all around the data center there. And those are obviously future conversations that we could probably have, but do you want to touch on some of those areas?
I'm glad you brought that up. So when we talk about a data center, it's not just the rack where the servers are located or the memory is located, but it's also what's between the rack and the actual energy generation unit.
Right.
So you have medium voltage that's being distributed. The medium voltage needs to be converted to a low voltage for consumption within the data center. You need to have protection for the power supply. So that means a UPS of some sort that triggers a transition when there's a power loss.
Right. So that's an uninterruptible power system.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And you could also have a secondary backup. It could be a generator that could be powered by diesel or some other fossil fuel if it may be. But you need to have both of these just because of how important and critical some of the data center functions are. Then you also have the HVAC solutions. You need something to cool all of this heat that's being generated from the data center, right? So all the energy that's being lost is being lost as heat. So, that needs to be cooled, and you have the HVAC systems, which is your air conditioners. And then you come to the server cabinets themselves. So the server cabinets, interestingly enough, have also increased in how much energy they consume because of AI. So where it used to be 3 kilowatts before, and that's where you talked about the Google search query, for example. Then you have the newer models that are requiring a lot more power because the chipsets are just more powerful. So in the same given footprint, you have an increase in how much power there's needed. So there's a trend moving from 3 kilowatts to 5 kilowatts to 8 kilowatts and even beyond. So that's just one server rack. Imagine having rows and rows, humming in the background, as you mentioned earlier. That's a lot of energy. So it's critical to have the conversion of this energy be efficient.
Right. And what I remember talking to Clayton about in one of our earlier episodes, and we talked about the electrification of everything, a data center could be like a football field, right? Those are some really sizable facilities run by the Mag 7, right?
That's absolutely right. You may not believe it, but Virginia happens to be a large state in terms of how many data centers they field. No pun intended. But this also brings imbalance to the grid that I was mentioning earlier. So one of the concerns is where the energy is being generated versus where it's being used. When you talk about the age of the grid, Europe is the only continent, if you will, that has an older grid than the Americas. So if you don't have an investment in improving the grid, you will likely see failures in the grid that could result in blackouts. And it's not just Virginia. There's other pockets of this. But, imagine football field sizes, data centers popping up in your background, right? And, it could be your house that has a blackout in the next surge. So it's dangerous. It's critical. It's, for the lack of a better term, we just need all of the right technologies to be applied to this problem so as to not have that future.
Right, and they're popping up everywhere, right? So data centers are starting to show up in as many different places as possible. So their proximity to a city, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like what you're saying, their proximity to a city is they could just suck out all the power that the city might need, and then all of a sudden you start seeing brownouts in the city.
Yep, exactly. The other concern that people have had is, these transformers, when they use the traditional silicon, they switch at a frequency which is in the audible range. Mm-hmm. So if you have transformers, not just for data centers, but generally speaking too, if you have transformers in a residential area, you have that hum in the background, and that's within the audible range. So silicon carbide and other wide bandgap technologies really help move that outside of the audible range. So it may not be a requirement from any agency, but it's just, better to have no noise in the background. You could sleep better, or maybe some people sleep better with the hum. Who knows?
Well, that's the noise we didn't even think about. So when we talked to Kevin about this in his omnidirectional episode, what he said was most transformers are passive, as in energy goes in one way and it leaves one way. And so the idea is there's no back and forth communication. What kind of effect would that have on a data center?
So looking out to the future, there is a possible conversation where they're going to a DC grid. Now, this goes back to Nikola and Tesla and Edison days, right? So where they were talking about the efficiencies of the AC grid versus the DC grid. So like with nuclear power, maybe they've come to the realization that DC grids are better. They're more efficient. So if you went to a DC grid, the traditional transformer would not make sense. You have to have a solid-state transformer. And by nature of design, you could have a bidirectional solid-state transformer. So if you had any backup in terms of batteries or generators, and you had the solid-state transformer, you could, in fact, power the grid with whatever you have as set up within this data center. So let's say you had those brownouts in your earlier topic, right? So you could technically use whatever power or energy stored within the data center to help support in those instances. Now, not saying that that will occur or, it's just a conversation today.
Right. So you're referring to the late 19th century current war, like Westinghouse and Edison and all that, like when the light bulb first became a thing. We're actually going back and reevaluating that conversation?
Appears so.
For those of you interested, there's a pretty good movie with Michael Shannon and Benedict Cumberbatch called The Current War that I thought was interesting. I saw it on a plane. I should go back and see it again. But now that that's a real conversation, that might be something worth revisiting. So I'm looking at all these other things that obviously they make sense looking at them, but I don't think people often think about it. So you've got your server racks. Your server racks are in a very large room. which they're cooking up a lot of heat. So obviously you're going to need an HVAC system. So that's heat pumps. And we're probably going to talk about heat pumps in another conversation. But then you've got your server cabinets that need to be maintained. And then you've got all these other things around here that I don't think anybody thinks about. So backup power, that's a thing. You mentioned uninterruptible power systems. That's a thing. Uninterruptible power systems, I don't think people in mature economies, specifically the West or the United States, really understand what a UPS is. You want to touch on that real quick? Because I know that there are areas that don't have consistent grids where UPS is a thing.
I'm glad you bring that up. And this could be an opportunity for a further conversation because there's something called energy storage systems, which are tied to some sort of generation. Let's say in the mature economies, somebody wants to have solar on their rooftop, but the solar, as we talked about earlier, only generates power during the day. So if they wanted to use some of this energy that they generated during the night, they need to have a battery backup of some sort. So that would be the energy storage system. So the UPS is in fact also being called an energy storage system in today's terminology. But you're right. So having grown up in India myself, we grew up with the term. We knew what it meant. But back then we used lead acid technology for the batteries, humongous, heavy. But all of the new gen ESS systems have lithium ion in them, so really compact, sleek, and nice looking. But I feel like you're going to have more of those in residences and industrial setups, similar to what we had, back home growing up.
Mm-hmm. So we've got HVAC solutions. Touch on security systems, lighting, fire protection, security alarms. Now those, I suppose it makes a lot of sense, but where does that come in? Are there conversations to be had there around security systems for a data center?
So let me take a step back and tell you why all of this is important. There's a term called power utilization efficiency, or PUE.
Mm-hmm.
And what this refers to is how much energy is used within the data center on everything but the actual compute. So the closer this number is to 1, the more energy is being utilized to, support the compute architecture. So all of these other parameters that you just mentioned need to be part of the conversation just so that we can reach the PUE of closer to 1. So you have countries that are mandating some of this. You have some of the companies, part of the Mac 7, that are mandating this. But, it's like a war with supercomputers where at one point it was always about who had the most compute power.
Right.
Now it's all about who has the best PUE.
So there was something we mentioned in the opener that you and I then had a different conversation on. It was this idea of 80 plus titanium. There are other standards?
There are some open source standards that people are working towards, which require higher and higher efficiencies. So when people talk about efficiency in a data center, anywhere really, it's a range of efficiencies: light load, medium load, and full load. So 80 plus titanium goes into what the efficiency should be at each of these different use cases, for example. But for simplicity's sake, and today, let's talk about, mid-load efficiency where, you're only 50% of how much power you need. There are some standards driving this from 96% in the titanium to greater than 97.5%. That may seem like a small number, 1.5%.
Right.
Hey, what's up with that? But it translates to the terawatts that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
It adds up quickly.
All right. So this, if I remember from Clayton's conversation, we have a kilowatt to a megawatt to a gigawatt.
Yep.
And then to a terawatt.
Exactly.
So a kilowatt times 1,000 gets you to a megawatt, times 1,000 gets you to a gigawatt, times 1,000 gets you to a terawatt.
Exactly right.
And we're going to need terawatts of power for our data center demand.
Yep. And when I talked about the doubling in energy requirements for data centers, that was just in 2 years. So the future is unknown.
Okay, so that now brings us to what we were talking about. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a review for those of you that were familiar with Kevin Spears' episode when we talked about the omnidirectional grid. Kevin's thesis was we're generating enough power now. He thinks that our existing grid, at least in the United States, that was where we framed our conversation. At least in the United States, we're generating enough power, but we lose so much of it from point of generation to point of consumption. And his thesis was, let's bring in silicon carbide. And he made a very compelling argument. How would that work in terms of the data center? Where does silicon carbide come in?
So silicon carbide can come into all of the various applications we just talked about. It could be in the generation. It could be in the movement of the energy from the generator to the substation, through the medium voltage transformer, through the UPS to the power distribution unit, and then finally on to the server rack. So in any of these areas, you could apply silicon carbide, low voltage, medium voltage, high voltage, to bring about the improvements in efficiencies.
So are there any specific devices or applications we're talking about? Any modules or any component level?
So let me start by talking about the incumbent solution.
Okay.
The incumbent is based on silicon. It could be a silicon MOSFET or a silicon IGBT. Now, these were great technologies, and people are familiar with the shortcomings of these technologies. And the reason we started working on wide bandgap is so as to address these shortcomings. Now, one of the improvements we can make with silicon carbide, because it's a wide bandgap technology, is that we can operate it at higher frequency, because the electrons just move faster within the material. You could also operate it at a higher temperature. So if there's an environment where silicon did not do well, and you had to have special packaging to accommodate that, or special cooling needs to accommodate that, you can move away and operate at the higher efficiencies and the temperatures because of silicon carbide. Now, the third aspect is cost. So when people started looking at silicon carbide, their first reaction was sticker shock. Oh my God, it's so expensive.
Right.
But the point that I think people missed before, but are starting to consider today, is that it's not the sticker price that's important, but it's also the overall cost of ownership. So it's like when you buy a car, why would somebody buy a Toyota versus something else, right? I mean, in the US at least, Toyotas are valued for their reliability.
Mm-hmm.
So silicon carbide has the same story. So you pay for the higher reliability, the higher efficiency, and the other improvements you can make within the system.
All right. So the upfront cost should be considered in terms of total cost of ownership?
Exactly.
All right. So suppose one of our listeners has a use case for this technology. Where could they go? Where should we send them?
You should go to microchip.com/SIC.
And that's our silicon carbide.
And that's SIC.
Product family page. So we know that our energy needs are increasing. We know that AI is pushing this forward. ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, Perplexity. There's a variety of them, and it's all an arms race right now. We know that investments in compute are, I've seen some numbers thrown around in terms of valuations between just, at the time we're recording this, Perplexity is going for a fourth round of funding. OpenAI has a gigantic valuation. So we're looking at serious investments in this, which means we can only expect more in terms of compute power and energy means. What kind of predictions do you have for the future of data center energy needs? And then, of course, where does silicon carbide come in? What's coming? Any idea what's on the horizon?
I'm no expert on the actual LLMs, but just given the trend, I wouldn't be surprised if we doubled every other year.
Whoa.
Just like all the valuations we talked about.
Moore's law for energy.
I assume so.
Got to take a moment to think about that. We've joked on the pod before, being that we're in Chandler, we're in Maricopa County, we're in the Phoenix Valley area. We've joked about the fact that our power bills are about $500 or $600 a month in the summer months. But now we're talking about a Moore's law for energy. And this isn't just within the United States, right? We're talking about a global demand, because these are applications that are popping up in countries all over the world.
That's exactly right. And you have, other trends that different countries have laws against where the data is stored. So that spurs, even if not directly for AI, but for data centers, for storage, you need to have data centers in every country now.
Right. And we talked about this when we talked about the I3C protocol. So data centers are not just for AI. AI is just what's driving the demand. We also have Netflix in every country. We also have cloud-based infrastructure. We also have. So we're looking at a serious exponential demand for energy that we simply can't satisfy today.
Right. I'm not predicting doomsday. There's going to be a point where it flats out and, everybody says, have had enough of, AI doing this for me, doing that for me. But I think as we're learning the capabilities of AI, we're going to continue to have this explosive need for energy and compute power.
But we have solutions available now that could address it in the future.
Exactly right.
Any final thoughts?
So we at Microchip are trying to solve today's problems while also being focused on tomorrow's problems. So silicon carbide is a solution. By no means is it the only solution. And we have a lot of use cases where it has been successful. So visit microchip.com/SIC for more information.
Great. Thank you, Nitesh. Nitesh Satish is a product marketing manager at Microchip Technology. He specializes in silicon carbide and power modules. He joins us today from our headquarters in Chandler, Arizona. Thank you for venturing beyond the microchip with us. Join us next time as we continue to explore empowering innovation to enhance the human experience.